everyone laughed when Grandma left me an old music box until her lawyer pressed play. The day my grandmother died, my entire family cried harder over her money than they did over her body. I know that sounds cruel, but if you had been sitting in that funeral home with me, watching my relatives whisper about bank accounts before Grandma's casket was even lowered into the ground, you'd know I'm telling the truth. My name is Olivia Carter, and I used to believe that grief brought families together. I was wrong. Sometimes it simply reveals who they really are. I learned that lesson the afternoon Grandma's final will was read, and by the time her lawyer finished speaking, half my family wanted to destroy me, while the other half couldn't even look me in the eye. But to understand why an old music box changed everything, I need to tell you who my grandmother really was. To everyone else, Margaret Carter was an 82-year-old widow whose memory had slowly faded over the last 7 years. My father often sighed dramatically whenever she repeated the same question twice. My Aunt Diane constantly rolled her eyes whenever Grandma forgot where she had left her glasses. Even my older cousin Jason joked that Grandma couldn't remember yesterday, let alone who deserved her inheritance. They all believed she was living in a fog of confusion. I wasn't so sure. Every Sunday afternoon, I visited her alone. We drank tea together in the sunroom of the nursing home while everyone else claimed they were too busy. During those visits, Grandma would sometimes forget the name of the nurse who had served her lunch 5 minutes earlier, yet she could describe in perfect detail the dress she wore to her high school graduation 65 years ago. She remembered the exact recipe for Grandpa's favorite apple pie. She remembered every birthday I'd ever spent with her. She even remembered that when I was 8 years old, I cried because I thought butterflies only live for one day. People with failing memories don't usually remember tiny moments like that. One afternoon, only 3 weeks before she died, Grandma suddenly grabbed my wrist while I was helping her fold a blanket. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She looked directly into my eyes, smiled, and whispered, "Never believe everything you see, Livy." I laughed softly. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she glanced toward the hallway to make sure nobody was listening. "They think I'm forgetting." She paused. I stopped correcting them. Before I could ask another question, a nurse entered the room with her medication. Grandma instantly changed her expression, stared blankly out the window, and asked what day it was. The nurse smiled sympathetically before answering. I stood there frozen. It felt like I had just watched an actress perform on a stage. For weeks afterward, I convinced myself I'd imagined the entire conversation. Then, Grandma died. The funeral was beautiful. She would have hated it. The flowers were expensive, the speeches were polished. My father cried loudly enough for everyone to notice. Aunt Diane leaned against her husband as if she'd lost the center of her universe, even though she hadn't visited Grandma in almost 5 months. Jason spent more time checking his phone than listening to the pastor. As for me, I couldn't stop staring at Grandma's favorite blue scarf folded neatly beside the casket. She wore that scarf every winter for nearly 20 years. Seeing it there made everything feel real in a way the flowers never could. After the burial, my father clapped his hands together and announced, "The lawyer wants us tomorrow morning. Let's get this over with." Not, "Let's honor Mom's wishes." Not, "Let's stay together." No, "Let's get this over with." Everyone knew what he meant. The inheritance. Grandma owned far more than people realized. She still possessed the family farmhouse, several rental properties, investments Grandpa had quietly built over decades, and enough savings to make every person in that room dream about what their share might be. Nobody said it out loud, but every conversation that evening somehow found its way back to money. The following morning, we gathered inside the office of Benjamin Harris, Grandma's attorney for nearly 30 years. His office smelled of polished wood and old books. Family portraits lined one wall, while thick legal volumes filled another. Everything about the room felt calm. My family did not. Jason whispered to his mother that the farmhouse alone was probably worth $2 million now. My father kept checking his expensive watch. Aunt Diane had already begun discussing renovation plans for a lake house she clearly believed she'd soon be able to afford. The room fell completely silent. Jason's grin vanished first. My father's smile slowly disappeared, while Aunt Diane awkwardly folded her arms as though she suddenly regretted laughing. Mr. Harris waited another few seconds before turning the tiny brass handle on the side of the music box exactly 3 times. A soft melody filled the office. It was the same lullaby Grandma used to play for me whenever I stayed at her house as a little girl. I hadn't heard it in over 20 years, yet every note came rushing back as if no time had passed at all. The music played for nearly 15 seconds. Then it stopped. Nothing happened. Cheeson laughed again. I knew it, he said. It's just an old music box. Mr. Harris looked at him without changing his expression. No. He carefully lifted the velvet lining inside the music box. I leaned forward. So did everyone else. Hidden beneath the velvet was a tiny brass key. It couldn't have been longer than 2 inches. Attached to it was a folded piece of paper that had turned slightly yellow with age. Mr. Harris unfolded it slowly before reading it aloud. Benjamin, if they're laughing when you reach this part, don't stop them. Let them laugh. They've earned it. Nobody moved. He continued reading. Give Olivia the key, then ask everyone else to stay exactly where they are, because what you're about to hear was never meant for honest people. The silence in the room became almost painful. Mr. Harris placed the key in my hand. It felt surprisingly heavy. Then he reached into his briefcase and removed a small digital recorder. I've kept this for almost 4 years, he said quietly. Margaret instructed me not to play it until today. Jason frowned. What is that? A recording. Of what? Mr. Harris looked directly at him. Of your grandmother. He pressed play. For a second, all we heard was static. Then Grandma's voice filled the office. It was weak, older, but unmistakably hers. If you're hearing this, then I suppose I've finally left all of you behind. My throat tightened instantly. First, Olivia. I froze. Sweetheart, thank you for visiting me every Sunday. Thank you for pretending my tea was still good after I forgot the sugar. Thank you for reading to me when my eyes grew tired. Most of all, thank you for treating me like I was still a person when everyone else had already decided I wasn't. Tears blurred my vision. Across the room, nobody dared interrupt. Grandma continued. Now I'd like to speak to everyone else. Her voice changed, not louder, just sharper. Robert, my father straightened in his chair. You stopped visiting me after I refused to sell the farmhouse. You only returned when the nurses started calling you because they couldn't reach anyone else. My father immediately shook his head. That's not true. Mr. Harris raised one finger. Please. The recording continued. Diane. My aunt lowered her eyes. Do you remember telling your husband I probably wouldn't survive another Christmas? You said it while standing outside my bedroom door. I heard every word. Aunt Diane's face turned white. I never... She stopped speaking. Grandma didn't. Jason. My cousin swallowed hard. You stole cash from my purse 3 different times. I never said anything because I wanted to see whether guilt would stop you before I died. Jason suddenly stood up. This is ridiculous. Mr. Harris calmly looked toward him. Sit down. I won't sit here listening to... Sit. For reasons I still don't understand, he obeyed. Grandma's voice softened again. All of you believed I couldn't remember yesterday. The truth is, I remembered far more than you ever imagined. Nobody breathed. I knew every fake smile, every lie, every whispered conversation in the hallway, every argument about my money. She paused. People think pretending to forget is frightening. Another pause. It isn't. The frightening part is discovering what your own family says when they think you can't remember. I looked around the room. Nobody could meet anyone else's eyes. Grandma continued speaking. Benjamin, if they're still sitting there, please tell Olivia to use the little key. Mr. Harris nodded toward me. There should be a small compartment underneath. I turned the music box upside down. At first, I couldn't find anything. Then my thumb brushed against a nearly invisible keyhole carved into the wood. The tiny key fit perfectly. I turned it once. A soft click echoed through the office. Another hidden compartment slowly opened. Inside wasn't jewelry, wasn't cash, wasn't another letter. It was a single USB flash drive. Attached to it was another handwritten note. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The note contained only one sentence. The people who laughed today have been stealing from this family for years. Jason suddenly leaned across the table. What is on that drive? Mr. Harris answered before I could. I already know. Everyone turned toward him. He removed his glasses, took a slow breath, then quietly said the sentence that changed everything. I helped Margaret collect the evidence myself. Nobody spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows an argument. It was the silence of people realizing that every lie they had carefully built over the years was beginning to crack. Jason was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and forced out a laugh that sounded much less confident than before. Evidence? He said. Against who? This is ridiculous. Grandma spent the last 7 years forgetting people's names. Now we're supposed to believe she secretly built a criminal case against her own family? Mr. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he plugged the flash drive into the laptop sitting on his desk and waited for the files to appear. There were dozens of folders, each labeled with a different year. My father frowned. Aunt Diane stopped pretending to be calm. Even I felt my stomach tighten, because whatever was inside that drive had clearly been organized over a long period of time. Mr. Harris clicked the first folder. Inside were scanned bank statements, property records, handwritten notes, photographs, and audio recordings. Nothing looked random. Everything had been carefully deeded and categorized. Grandma hadn't simply hidden memories inside an old music box. She had built an archive. Mr. Harris opened the first document. It showed a transfer of nearly $80,000 from one of Grandma's investment accounts into a company owned by Jason. The date caught everyone's attention. The transfer had taken place only 6 months after Grandpa died. Jason immediately stood up. She invested that money with me. Mr. Harris calmly shook his head. No, she didn't. He opened another file. A signed authorization form appeared on the screen. The signature looked almost identical to Grandma's. Almost. Mr. Harris zoomed in. The bank's handwriting expert concluded this signature was forged. Jason's face lost all color. I don't know anything about that. Mr. Harris clicked another folder. This time it contained photographs. The first showed Jason entering Grandma's house while she was in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. The second showed him leaving 3 hours later, carrying a locked metal box. The third showed the same box being loaded into the trunk of his car. I had permission, Jason snapped. Mr. Harris looked toward another file. No. He pressed play. Grandma's voice filled the room again. Benjamin, if Jason ever tells anyone I gave him permission to enter my house while I was hospitalized, he's lying. Jason slammed both hands onto the table. This is insane. My father finally spoke. Jason, tell me she's wrong. Jason looked at him, then looked away. That answer was enough. The room became even quieter than before. Mr. Harris closed the folder and opened another one, labeled Diane. Aunt Diane's breathing became noticeably faster. Inside were copies of medical invoices from the nursing home. For almost 3 years, Grandma had been paying for a private physical therapist to help strengthen her legs after a fall. According to the invoices, the therapist suddenly stopped visiting because someone had canceled the service. Who canceled it? I asked. Mr. Harris opened a scanned email. The request had come from Aunt Diane. Her reason was simple. She won't notice the difference. Aunt Diane immediately burst into tears. I was trying to save money. Mr. Harris looked at her. It wasn't your money. She lowered her head. For the first time in my life, I realized something painful. None of them were denying what they had done anymore. They were only trying to explain why they had done it. Mr. Harris clicked the final folder. Its name was Robert. My father's hands immediately tightened around the armrests of his chair. This is unnecessary. I don't think Margaret would agree. Mr. Harris replied quietly. The first document appeared. It was the deed to the family farmhouse. The second was a loan application. The third was a contract agreeing to sell the farmhouse to a real estate developer. The date made my heart stop. It had been signed 8 months before Grandma died. 8 months! Dad had already arranged to sell the house before he even knew whether he would inherit it. No, I whispered. He looked at me. I was only exploring my options. Mr. Harris slowly removed another envelope from the folder. Margaret expected you to say exactly that. He handed it to me. Inside was another handwritten letter. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Olivia, if your father claims he only planned to sell the farmhouse after my death, ask him why he accepted a deposit almost a year before I died. I slowly lifted another piece of paper from the envelope. It was a copy of a cashier's check, made payable to my father. Amount received, $250,000. The room exploded. Aunt Diane stood up and turned toward my father. You took money without telling us? Jason stared at him in disbelief. You said we were waiting for the will. My father tried speaking, but nobody listened. For years, they had lied to each other. Now they were discovering they hadn't even trusted one another. I sat perfectly still, watching the people I'd called family tear themselves apart. Then Mr. Harris raised his voice for the first time all afternoon. Please. Everyone stopped. He reached beneath his desk one last time. There is still one final instruction from Margaret. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He placed a thick, sealed envelope on the table. Across the front, written in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. Open this, only after they betray each other. No one reached for the envelope. Only a few minutes earlier, everyone in that office had been convinced they were about to leave with money, property, and happy smiles. Now they looked as though they were waiting for a judge to announce prison sentences. My father stared at the sealed envelope without blinking. Aunt Diane had stopped crying and simply sat there with both hands wrapped tightly around each other. And Jason looked ready to walk out, yet he hadn't taken a single step toward the door. Mr. Harris finally broke the silence. Margaret left very specific instructions. She said this envelope could only be opened after the family began turning against one another. Judging by the last 10 minutes, I'd say she knew all of you better than you knew yourselves. He carefully slid a letter from inside the envelope and began reading. To my family. If Benjamin is reading this letter, then everything happened exactly as I expected. Before any of you start blaming each other, understand this. None of you became greedy because of my money. My money simply revealed who you already were. Nobody spoke. I spent 7 years pretending my memory was disappearing. At first, I hated every second of it. I hated being ignored. I hated hearing people finish my sentences. I hated watching strangers feel sorry for me. But then, something unexpected happened. People stopped hiding the truth from me. They spoke freely in front of me. They argued about my house while I was sitting beside them. They divided my jewelry before I had even died. They discussed how long they thought I had left. The moment they believed I couldn't remember, they stopped pretending to be good people. My chest tightened. She hadn't recorded those words out of anger. She had recorded them out of heartbreak. Mr. Harris continued reading. There is one question every person in this room has been asking since the day I wrote my will. Who receives the largest share of my estate? The answer is simple. The person who never asked. Everyone slowly turned toward me. I immediately shook my head. No! Mr. Harris reached into the envelope again and unfolded another legal document. I have here a codicil to Margaret Carter's will, signed 18 months after the original version. This document automatically takes effect if evidence of fraud, theft, forgery, or financial exploitation by any beneficiary is confirmed. Jason frowned. What does that mean? Mr. Harris looked directly at him. It means the inheritance you celebrated no longer exists. The room froze. The farmhouse goes to Olivia. The investment accounts go to Olivia. The rental properties go to Olivia. The remaining savings also go to Olivia. For several long seconds, nobody even breathed. Then my father stood so quickly, his chair crashed onto the floor. "This is impossible. It is perfectly legal. You can't rewrite the will after she's dead." "I'm not rewriting it," Mr. Harris replied calmly. "Margaret already did." Aunt Diane's voice shook. "So, she planned this?" "For years." Jason slammed his fist against the table. "This whole thing was a trap." Mr. Harris slowly nodded. "No, it was a test." He opened another folder and slid several photographs across the table toward them. "Margaret gave every one of you dozens of opportunities to prove her wrong." The photographs showed birthdays she had spent alone, Christmas dinners where her chair sat empty, hospital visits where only nurses were present. Beside each photograph was a visitor's log from the nursing home. Most weeks, only one name appeared. Mine. I felt tears filling my eyes again, not because of the inheritance, because I hadn't known she was keeping track. Mr. Harris smiled sadly. "She never cared how much time people spent with her." He paused. "She cared why they came." Another silence settled over the room. Then he reached beneath the desk one final time. I almost forgot. Everyone looked at him. Margaret left one last message, not a recording, a handwritten letter. She addressed it to Olivia alone. He handed it to me. The paper felt soft with age. I unfolded it carefully. "My sweet Livy, if you're reading this, then I was right about everything except one thing. I spent years believing our family had become impossible to save. Then you kept showing up every Sunday with homemade cookies that tasted terrible, stories about your week that I had already heard 3 times, and enough patience to make an old woman believe kindness still existed. You never visited because you wanted my house. You never asked about my bank accounts. You never once asked what I planned to leave you. You gave me the one gift nobody else offered, your time. People think inheritance is about money. It isn't. Inheritance is about trust. Money can be stolen. Trust cannot. Everything I built with your grandfather belongs to the only person who treated us like family, even after everyone else started treating us like opportunities." By the time I reached the end of the letter, I could barely see the words through my tears. I looked up. No one was looking at me anymore. They were all staring at the floor. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't protecting their lies. It was forcing them to live with them. Then my father quietly asked the only question that still mattered. "Is there any way to challenge this?" Mr. Harris folded his hands. There was. My father looked up hopefully. Mr. Harris finished the sentence. "You should have thought about that. While Margaret was still alive." Nobody argued after that. The anger that had filled the office only minutes earlier slowly gave way to something much heavier. Shame. My father lowered himself back into his chair without saying another word. Jason kept staring at the table, as if avoiding everyone's eyes could somehow erase what had just happened. Aunt Diane quietly wiped away tears that, for the first time all afternoon, didn't look forced. Mr. Harris closed the folder containing Grandma's evidence and gently pushed it aside. "Margaret asked me to say one last thing before you leave," he said. "She didn't want this family destroyed. She wanted it to have one final chance to tell the truth." No one answered. Mr. Harris looked around the room before continuing. "She believed people deserve forgiveness, but only after honesty." The room remained silent. Then something happened that I never expected. My father slowly stood up and walked toward me. For a moment, I honestly thought he was going to argue again. Instead, he stopped a few feet away. "I owe you an apology." His voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. I convinced myself that Mom didn't know what she was doing, and it made everything easier. Easier to ignore her, easier to make decisions without asking her, easier to tell myself I deserved what she had built. He looked down at the floor. I don't think I realized how much of myself I had lost. I didn't answer, not because I was angry, because I didn't know what to say. Aunt Diane slowly walked over as well. "When your grandmother called me every Tuesday," she whispered, "I usually let the phone ring." A tear weaved down her cheek. I'd tell myself I'd call her back later. She forced a sad smile. Later never came. Jason remained seated for almost a minute before finally standing. I'd stole from her. The words were barely audible. I kept telling myself I'd pay it back. He laughed bitterly. I never did. Nobody judged him. There was nothing left to expose.